Fundamentals of Occultism and Spiritual Unfoldment by truthscrambler.com. I wanted to do this video for newcomers to the occult as sort of a basic introductory level course or primer into this field. And I also want to mention that to fully appreciate everything I'm putting out on my channel, you really have to watch all the videos. They're all connected. They're all about really the same thing, same topic, but each video comes at it from a different angle. There's many ways to the core of the apple, and you have to really look at it as a tapestry and take each part as part of the whole, really. So with that, let's get started. And I want to start with a thought experiment using our imagination. I want you to imagine that there is an aspect of yourself in the future, an aspect of yourself that is more highly evolved than you are now, and that encompasses everything you would like to be. Imagine that this you exists in another plane of existence that, well, to us here, it appears as the future, but really this other plane is outside time altogether. Now imagine then that this highly evolved future version of you can and does contact you in the present moment. These contacts are subtle, though, and can happen through dreams, synchronistic events, flashes of intuition, chance meetings with certain people at certain times, etc. This future version of you wants you to come to it. It's not going to do the work for you, because then you don't evolve. It's calling you like a magnet, but you have to heed the call. This aspect of yourself can also be called the Christ in you, or the Christ impulse, or Christ consciousness, etc. Now, let's look at how this thought experiment shows up in symbolism. For example, the very, very basic symbols, the cross and the circle. You can see that the cross is you in the present. The upright line is the human body, specifically the spinal cord, and the horizontal line is linear time, you going through time. While the circle is your higher self. It's this future self outside time that we were speaking of, shown by the completion of a circle, or time folding back in on itself to achieve perfection. So you can take that vertical line and bend it in on itself to form the circle. Now, if this is the case, and if this is more than just a thought experiment, then the present moment is really like an interference pattern. So you go from A to B through time, and you're growing. So these sonar wave-looking curves are growing as you get to B, because you're expanding, you're evolving. But how is this really happening? It's because you are getting in touch with your future self, which is guiding you along the way. So this present moment is more of an interference pattern, with the future self streaming back, represented by these green curvy lines here. So, keeping in mind the cross and the circle and what they represent, we can also look at astrological symbols, the sun, the moon, and the cross. And then we're going to see how all the planetary symbols hold these three symbols in different combinations. So the circle is the sun. It's your future self outside of time. It's also been called super consciousness. Whereas the moon is this crescent, it's going to be the past self, or what Paul Foster Case calls race memory, which is similar to Jung's collective unconscious idea. And then again, the cross, but now with the circle around it, is both a symbol for Earth and a symbol for the human body in its present form, as well as self-consciousness or ego consciousness or waking consciousness. And the moon also could be dreaming consciousness or sleeping. And just quickly wanting to touch on how the tarot cards map perfectly onto this as well. Cards 0, 1, and 2, the Fool, is the sun, because it's card 0, again, the 0 shape being like the circle, the sun. The Fool is the most important card of the whole tarot. It's most closely associated with deity or divinity, and it can be God, but it can also be yourself, your future self, outside of time, like we were saying, super consciousness. Now the moon is the high priestess. You can see that her headdress, I guess you would call it, is the 3 phases of the moon. It's got the full moon and then the 2 crescents, the waxing and waning moon. And the moon is duality, so we've got the black and white pillars, because the moon goes through these growing and shrinking, growing and dying away phases. Unlike the sun, the moon has this strong duality effect of dying and becoming. And we see the water of her gown. We'll get into that. So moon is closely tied with water. Sun is closely tied with fire. And the human body, the magician, is represented by air, the mediator between fire and water. So the magician, card number 1, is the human body in its present form, like the cross, like the vertical line of the number 1. So keep these symbols in mind, these patterns. We're going to return to the tarot, but I want to go back to the astrology and looking at the planets here, the symbols of the planets, and how it gets into the zodiac and your zodiac sign and how that relates to your personality. So let's look at some different personality types based on the symbols. Let's start with Mars. So if you look at the symbol for Mars, well, first of all, its ruling signs are Aries and Scorpio. So if you're an Aries or a Scorpio, Mars is your ruling planet. And so we see the circle of superconsciousness. We see the cross, but the cross is bent or deformed into an arrow shape. So what is this saying? So the martial type is one who raises the ego consciousness above the super consciousness. So I'm going to read a little bit from Paul Foster Case here. So I'm quoting here. He says, Mars is represented by a symbol which combines the sun symbol of super consciousness with the cross of self-consciousness, but the cross slants to one side. Mars is described in astrology as hot, dry, masculine, electric, inflammatory, signifying strength and force. The symbol shows a combination of self-consciousness with super-consciousness, but with self-consciousness in the ascendant, or above. So thus, Mars puts us in contact with the great, undifferentiated life power, but it deceives us with the belief that this power is our personal possession. Again, the cross. Martians are impulsive, fiery, energetic because they feel strongly the urge of the cosmic life, even though they misinterpret it. Mars rules the brain and is dominant in the reproductive centers also. Scorpio. It cares nothing for forms and ceremonies because it has no part in the accumulated experience of race consciousness Also race memory, which is the moon, right? There's no moon in that symbol. The typical Martian is courageous, adventurous, iconoclastic, and questing. In bad combinations, this force becomes violent, quarrelsome, self-assertive without regard to the rights of others. But it is by no means malefic. It is the power that has brought the race to its present point of evolution, the aspect of the one life power which gives us direct contact with the limitless energy of the one light, even though it deludes us into the belief that the cosmic force we feel within us is our own personal strength. End quote. Okay, so now let's look at the Venusian type. So the Venusian is the opposite or complement to Mars. Because look, you can see now the cross is below the circle of superconsciousness. So with the Venusians, who are Taurus and Libra, it's flipped. So now they value superconsciousness, or the one life power, as Case calls it. They value that over the identity of the self, the ego, which is the cross. Okay, so I'm going to read again here, quoting, Venus is the complement of Mars as Jupiter is the opposite of Saturn. The typical Venusian is the artist, in whom the cross of self-consciousness is subordinate to the circle of superconsciousness. The inspiration of the artist is from superconsciousness, and his intellectual, self-conscious processes are always subordinate to the impulses which come to him from this higher plane, him or her. Thus, artists are notoriously unbusinesslike, and when they are at their best, they are singularly unselfish and free from the narrow aspects of self-consciousness. This is why so many people in the artistic field are fond of such books as Ouspensky's Tertium Organum or Buck's Cosmic Consciousness. Often they do not grasp what they read intellectually, but somehow they feel the essential rightness of such teachings and respond to it emotionally. End quote. Now I want to add, before I move on, that you could also look at Mars and Venus as masculine and feminine, but in a sense they are representing the limited aspects of each gender polarity. So Mars is like the incomplete male, or maybe the imbalanced masculine. Venus here is the imbalanced feminine. And we're going to get to Mercury, which is the only symbol that has all three symbols for the complete type. But before we do that, let's look at Jupiter and Saturn. So the Jupiterian, if you're a Sagittarius or a Pisces, this is your ruling planet. And both these signs are expansive. Sagittarius loves to travel. Pisces loves to do inner travel through meditation and art and these kind of things, dreaming. So Jupiter is expansive while Saturn is limiting, as we'll see. Okay, so quoting from Paul Case, Jupiter is the reverse of Saturn. Here we see the domination of self-consciousness by the subconsciousness. Okay, so I want to add here, unquoting, you see the moon is above the cross. I should have mentioned that. Quote, hence astrologers make Jupiter the significator of the priesthood, formal religion, and the law. Some astrologers, it is true, say that Jupiter rules reason and judgment, but the reasoning is always based on precedent, that is to say, upon the race consciousness, race memory. Jupiter is usually regarded by the old astrologers as benefic, because when this combination is strong in a man's horoscope, he will conform to established customs so that he adapts himself easily to the conditions of his time. And whoever does this usually prospers from a worldly point of view. And it must be confessed that most of the earlier astrologers were worldlings, who looked upon worldly honors, wealth, position at court, and the like as the greatest benefits that can come to a man. But all these things come to people who obey the rules of the game, as it happens to be played in their day and age. And those rules are all based upon precedents rooted in the subconsciousness. Okay, the moon. A Jupiterian man may be a man of common sense, and he will have what is usually described as good judgment, because he will always conform. He will go to the established church. He will be a conservative in politics. He will be a staunch supporter of all the good old customs of his ancestors. In him, therefore, subconsciousness really triumphs over self-consciousness in any situation where there is likely to be a contest between the two. A Jupiterian succeeds because he is in harmony with his time, because he is dominated by the currents of race consciousness. End quote. Okay, now Saturn, which is my type, by the way. I'm a Capricorn. So if you're a Capricorn or Aquarius, then Saturn is your ruling planet. And you can see the flip of what we just saw. So now the moon, or the crescent, is below the cross. So you can imagine that self-consciousness is, it triumphs over race consciousness or race memory, or the collective, you could say. Quoting here, the Saturn symbol combines the cross and crescent, but with the crescent below. Astrologers say that Saturn is binding, limiting, concrete. It is associated by them with all that is cold, dry, harsh, of the earth and earthy, and they regard it usually as malefic. It gives resolution and determination, ability for profound studies, industry, and perseverance, when its vibration is harmonious with that of the other planetary forces. But out of harmony with the others, it is obstructive, melancholy, and disappointing. For it is always what the symbol shows, a combination of self-consciousness and subconsciousness in which there is no touch of the superconscious, the sun, the circle, and in which reason, the characteristic quality of the self-conscious plane, is uppermost. In the practice of astrology, we find that Saturn's influence in good combinations brings success through good reasoning, and that the failures in bad combinations may always be traced to actions influenced by misuse of the reasoning powers. Thus, an ill-aspected Saturn will make a man act from motives rooted in the sense of separateness, and his actions will injure himself and harm others. End quote. Right, because this sense of separateness comes from the ego, the waking consciousness, the cross, identity, the magician, etc. Your sense of self in the present moment, not in touch with your future self outside time. And finally, the mercurial type. So as I was saying, you can see there's all three. The moon, the sun, and the cross are combined harmoniously in Mercury. So if you're a Virgo or a Gemini, this is your ruling planet. So I'll quote here. Mercury alone among the planetary symbols combines all three elements. The crescent symbol of subconsciousness is uppermost. The circle, representing superconsciousness, is in the middle, and the cross of self-consciousness is at the bottom. Thus, Mercury represents the equilibration of all three planes of consciousness. Do not understand that the placing of the crescent symbol at the top means that the subconsciousness has been made superior. What is meant is that the subconsciousness has been purified and raised so that it becomes the grail to receive the wine of life, the inspiration of spiritual wisdom. The cross is below to show that self-consciousness performs its work in its own sphere, which is that of adjusting the personal expression of life to environment. But in the central position is the circle of superconsciousness, supporting the cup of the subconscious activities, and sending down its currents of wisdom to the self-conscious plane. So rightly understood, this Mercury sign is one of the most enlightening symbols in the whole occult vocabulary. Okay, end quote. So, finishing with Mercury, you can see that the Crescent Moon is also the cup, or the grail, receiving. So it's a receiving impulse. So receptivity to the higher self. I want to just finish with some tarot. And again, seeing how these three symbols, the cross, the moon, and the sun, are really lined up with not just cards 0, 1, and 2, but really with the whole deck. So let's look at the moon, the crescent, again, as tied to the high priestess. So again, this is the past self, the race memory, the collective unconscious. Now, when Paul Case uses the term race memory, the term race it's first of all, it's the whole human race, because we all have the same archetypal patterns embedded in our subconscious memory. But then a layer slightly above that, we have our specific race, or you could say ethnicity, culture that you currently incarnated into as like a more recent subconscious layer of memory, which informs life. Okay, so the woman. So the moon is the feminine. The sun is the masculine. So the woman in the Bible is really the same. It's a symbol for anything material, materiality. Also water is the same symbol. You can watch my video about the LMN liquids, the letters LMN. The middle of the alphabet are feminine letters, also liquid letters. The beginning of the alphabet is always fire, the letter A and B. So we have Gaia, we have Mother Earth, materiality, we have the old moon phase. The Earth's previous phase was called Old Moon, if you read Rudolf Steiner's work. And also the symbol for this is anything animalistic, because humankind went through you could say, an animal stage on the old moon in preparation for becoming human. Now, this doesn't mean that Darwin was right, because this all happened not in a material plane, but on the spiritual plane. Before anything like materiality occurred, we experienced something of an animal consciousness. So you'll see in the occult frequently bulls and rams and goats and dogs and all sorts of animals that are tied with the moon, with the past, and with water. I even wrote a whole book, a short ebook, which I'll link in the description, on just this topic alone, the zootypes. And it's interesting, the bull especially is maybe the most profound zootype. And the bull is really closely associated with the moon because the crescent moon is like the horns of the bull. And also the letter A, if you flip it upside down, you can see it's the head of the bull with the horns. The Taurus, Taurus, which is also shaped like the Taurus field, Taurus. And it's interesting that if you look closely at the high priestess, the scrolls that she's holding, it says Torah. Okay, so you've got tarot, Torah, Taurus, and Taurus field. Also Hathor, if you do a little bit of flipping the letters around, Hathor was the Egyptian moon, the Egyptian cow goddess. Okay, so card 1 is the Magician, waking consciousness, self-consciousness, mankind in its present form. Now with the I, the human I, capital letter I, which separates us from the animals. So when we were in our animal stage on Old Moon, we had a physical form, an etheric body, and an astral body. But no, our I was not ready to incarnate yet, but was sort of hovering above the waters, you could say. So all animals today are like that. They have a physical body, ether body, and astral body, but the I, the ego, is not present in the animals. Now each animal species has a group soul or group I, and that I exists on a higher plane. That's a little bit too far afield to get into now. But the Magician is a symbol, well, the ruling element is air, and air is the mediator between fire and water. So on the next card, the Fool, we're going to see fire, and then again, so the High Priestess is water, flowing water on her gown. And also it's interesting that Gemini, which is an air sign, rules the Magician card, and the symbol for Gemini, the two pillars, kind of also graphically looks like a capital I. Interesting. Okay, card 0, the Fool, the crowning card of the whole major arcana. And the letter, well, you can see the sun in the card. You can see the oval behind the Fool as sort of graphically the number 0, or also just a portal into heaven, or the central sun, if you will. You see the dog at the heels of the Fool. The dog here is the personality or the ego that's chasing after the super consciousness, your higher self in the future. Now the Fool could also be like your angel, your angelic self. The Hebrew letter is Aleph, which is the letter A, which is connected or corresponds to the ox. And the ox is the castrated bull. So it's sort of androgynous, just like angels are androgynous. They've transcended gender, you could say. And if you look at the letter A, which again is a upside down bullhead or Taurus, you can see what is the letter A. It's a splitting or a dividing from the central sun, from your higher self, from the Fool. It's a splitting into two downward directions, past and future, with the present moment as the horizontal crossbar, connecting the two. So if you were to look outside of time at you, at yourself, you see the past and future dividing from a central point, just like the letter A here. And so fire is associated here, and heaven is the fiery realm, and earth is the watery realm with air in between. And again, the letter Aleph, this is a quote from my book on the Zootypes. So the letter Yod is the flame, and Hebrew is known as the flame alphabet. All the letters are basically derivations of the Yod. And the Yod, it's not just a flame, but you can see it's a bent flame to represent God blowing the original impulse, his original impulse of creativity into creation. So I'm gonna read here from my book. The Yod is the flame, which is why in Hebrew it is called the flame alphabet, where each letter is a derivation of the one Yod, which in informal writing is sometimes just the dot or the period or the point in space. Thus the letter Aleph above represents the state of duality that man is in, where fire and spirit has met water and matter, which is just spirit flipped upside down or polarized in a different modality. The soul, or fire, incarnates into matter or water, and has to work its way back out of matter, back to source. But everything is all topsy-turvy and backwards and flipped here. As Paul and Corinthians say, we see through a glass darkly. So we have two Yods in the letter Aleph. One is flipped upside down to represent the moon or earth. And there's a dividing line between them to represent the present. And the upside down Yod is like a reflection of the upright Yod, just like the sun and the moon. Well, the moon is a reflection, so apparently it reflects sunlight. Okay, so a few more tarot cards here. So the Empress card 3 is also a symbol of this great work. The Empress is the evolved High Priestess. Here she's pregnant with the Christ child. So the High Priestess is like the subconscious mind before it's been worked on by the magician. You'll see here her foot is on the moon, showing mastery over the less evolved past, or the animalistic forces, the race memory, etc. She is in a pruned and tamed garden, growing the wheat, showing mastery over nature. She has transmuted desire, represented by the 5 roses, which could also be the 5 senses, sensuality. Her shield has the white dove of purity, representative of the Virgin Mary. The river behind her is a continuation of the river in card 2, flowing from the High Priestess's gown. Here her gown is green, the color of Venus, the planet of love. The background is yellow, like the Magician's card, showing its connection to the waking ego consciousness, or the present. The Moon, card 18. Like we said, animals are a record of the past phases of humanity. They are a hardening or a casting off of old forms on the path of progressive evolution. The moon is also a cast-off portion of the earth that holds its old karma. So it's a little bit too much to get into now, but the moon that we see currently, when we die, our soul goes through the moon, and that is the sphere where we release our negative or evil karma, which is why you can see here the misunderstanding about the Saturn moon matrix, where people thinking we're stuck in a trap system, because really what's happening is the karma, the negative karma, is being sort of held in the moon, and that's what eventually sucks our soul back to Earth. But this is a good thing. This is how we transmute our karma. Anyway, continuing here, so the dog on this card is a tamed wolf, meaning it's progressive. The wolf itself is a wild animal, not tamed. It's the past self. That's why it's the wolf that howls at the moon, right? The moon is the past. The wolf is the past. It's untamed. Same we saw with the bull or the cow who jumps over the moon. And the Hebrew letter here is Kof, which is a glyph for the back of the head or the brain stem, which rules sleep and autonomic functions while we sleep. Which, again, when the moon is out at night, that's when we go to sleep. And the purple mountains in the background show the path of attainment. When we conquer the lower animalistic drives and we evolve our soul, we climb the purple mountain back up to where the Fool stands at the top of the cliff. You can see the purple mountains on the Fool card as well. So the purple color is the highest vibration color, right? Before you get into ultraviolet, which you can't see, you see purple first. Okay, last card here, the Sun card 19. We see little children dancing in a field of sunflowers, which reminds me of the quote from the Bible where Christ says, "Except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter the kingdom of heaven." So what is this saying here? What is he saying? I believe he's saying your higher self from the future is calling to you in that quiet and still voice that children are more capable of hearing, being a little bit more psychic. The children are dancing naked, showing that your higher self wants you to be free, shedding the restraints of culture, keeping you confined in egoic thinking, the norm, the race memory, not breaking out of the mold or expectations set by your family, race, creed, etc. These moon forces. In that same chapter, Matthew, Christ also says, "He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me." So that's what this is saying. He's not saying don't love your parents. It's the mother and father here are the past, the race memory, staying with the old ways, not evolving towards the future, towards Christ consciousness. Thank you.